It would surprise you to know that most things we associate with ancient Egyptians, such as wigs, dark eye makeup, and the use of creams and lotions, were not only used for aesthetic reasons, but as important tools for survival in a land that was constantly scorched by an unforgiving sun and plagued by all manner of vermin such as rats and scorpions. This is History Rediscovered. To support, please subscribe. In this episode, we discuss how ancient Egyptians tackled the issue of hygiene. Some of the things they did will come as a shock to you. For ancient Egyptians, food preparation took place in unsanitary, disgusting conditions and often used contaminated water. The Nile has always been an important part of Egyptian life. The ancient Egyptians relied on it heavily. It provided them with their bathing and drinking water. Its regular flooding left its banks covered in fertile mud that was excellent for growing food. Since only the wealthy could afford bathrooms, people among the lower classes used the fields and the Nile itself as toilets. As a result, disease and other contaminants often came into contact with crops. This contamination carried on in lower-class households. Milling grains to make bread and preparing other meals usually took place on the floors of open-air rooms or on their roofs if their homes didn't have kitchens. As a result, vermin often infested homes and areas where food was kept. Afterwards, they disposed of their garbage outdoors and washed their dirty dishes in the often contaminated Nile. People washed their clothing in parasite-infested water. The fashion of ancient Egypt was influenced heavily by the climate. As such, clothing consisted of light and breathable fabrics such as linen and flax. Because the fabric was white in color, it required regular washing to keep it looking clean. So, how did the ancient Egyptians go about cleaning their clothing? Clothing had to be soaked, beaten, twisted, and rinsed by hand in order to remove dirt. The task was often left to the men as it was such a labor-intensive process. Those who could afford larger wardrobes, usually the wealthy, hired others to do their laundry, and they made use of facilities specifically designed for laundry. The lower classes had to contend with hand-washing their clothing in the Nile River, the same river that people used to dump garbage and relieve themselves. This left the river a breeding ground for parasites and diseases. But that wasn't even the most dangerous part of washing in the Nile. Washers had to constantly keep an eye out for lurking hippos and crocodiles. The majority of ancient Egyptians simply bathed in the Nile, while only the wealthy had access to bathing facilities. Due to the climate, the average Egyptian bathed at least once every day. The methods they employed while bathing tended to depend on their social standing. The lower class, which made up most of Egyptian society, simply bathed themselves in the Nile itself. The wealthiest classes went about it in a different way. They stood on stone slabs and had water carried from the Nile in large basins or jugs poured on them by their servants. Natron was used as soap for scrubbing. Afterwards, they applied moisturizing creams to keep their skin soft and supple. Some of those upper-class homes also had dedicated foot baths crafted of wood, ceramic, and stone. They used these often as shoes weren't common. People relieved themselves outdoors, as only the wealthy like kings and queens owned toilets. Ancient Egyptians had no sewer systems. The lower classes who could not afford luxurious toilets had to relieve themselves outdoors, often in holes they had dug in the ground. Others took to using the Nile as their bathroom. A stark contrast to the toilets owned by wealthy. The toilets featured seats made of limestone. The stone sat atop a box filled with sand, and unfortunately, someone had the job of emptying the box out after it was used. Despite the ancient Egyptians' devotion to cleanliness, garbage often wound up in pits and canals, which ended up contaminating the river and fields where people grew their food. As such, many lives were lost each year due to unsanitary conditions and diseases. Ember and barley were used as means to test for pregnancy. One of the many innovations that ancient Egyptians pioneered was something that by today's standards would be an early pregnancy test. Women physicians had women suspected of being pregnant to urinate on a combination of barley and ember. If neither of these two grew, the woman was not pregnant. If the barley grew, she was pregnant with a boy, and if the ember grew, she would bear a girl child. Though this is not the only method in which fertility was tested in ancient Egypt, it was one of the most effective. Evidenced when researchers in the late 20th century validated the technique and found that more than half the tests performed by pregnant women saw the barley or ember grow. a stark contrast to tests carried out with urine from males and non-pregnant women which show no growth. They developed ingenious methods to combat pests such as mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are probably one of the most annoying insects out there, and even the ancient Egyptians were plagued by them. How did they deal with them? They constructed towers around the rooms they used for sleeping. If a mosquito attempted to fly over the tower, the wind higher up would prevent them from doing so. Such towers were mainly implemented in the upper parts of the marshes around the Nile. It would also surprise you to know that the ancient Egyptians also implemented the use of mosquito nets, not the ones we have around now, but similar enough to still be effective. They took care of their hands and feet and often had manicures done. It's a little known fact about ancient Egyptian culture that manicurists held a favored position in society. They were employed by the wealthiest Egyptians to help maintain their fingernails and keep them looking clean and healthy. They were so proud of their roles that they prominently displayed their job title of manicurist on their tombs after they passed. The most common tools used by them were files, which they used to shape and give a uniform look to fingernails, and small knives, which they used to clean and trim nails. Although these were mostly used by manicurists that tended to the upper class. It's believed that members of the lower class took care of their nails in a similar fashion, albeit with less expensive tools. The Egyptians paid special attention to their feet, regardless of class. They used special creams and ointments to keep their feet soft, to keep them from cracking, and most importantly, to keep from attracting insects. They shaved their bodies and adopted wigs as a way to prevent lice. You've probably come across movies or pictures depicting ancient Egypt, and in almost all of them, Egyptians are seen as either clean-shaven or sporting wigs. But why is that? It all has to do with lice. These tiny little parasites tormented the ancient Egyptians so much that they decided to take drastic measures to ensure that the bugs could not live on their bodies. People shaved off all their hair using knives, razors, and tweezers so as to deprive the lice of areas in which they could live. After that, they kept their heads carefully shaved and polished. It was a practical idea, because shaved heads helped to keep them cool. It was common for only children to have their natural hair. They shaved it as they grew older. Wigs were also another practical idea because they were light and yet they offered protection from sunstroke when people were out and about. The wealthiest Egyptians often owned several different styles of wigs which they wore to different occasions. These wigs were made of either human hair or horse hair. Members of the lower classes couldn't always afford to have wigs made, so they wore head coverings or made wig-like creations from papyrus. If a wig did get infested with lice, it could easily be disposed of and replaced. But despite their best efforts, the ancient Egyptians could not completely overcome the issue of lice infestations. Although ancient Egyptians didn't have to worry about things like sugar decaying their teeth, they developed a type of toothpaste that they used to clean their teeth of sand, which if left unchecked, ended up wearing down teeth. Their toothpaste consisted of materials such as salt, flowers, and even mint, which were then ground into a powder. As the powder was brushed over their teeth, using their fingers, it mixed with saliva to form a paste. Eventually, though, they developed simple toothbrushes using a stick bound with thin strip of plants on one end of the stick which acted as bristles. Thank you for watching. Which of these practices came as a shock to you?